Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, 24 hours ago, we learnt the news that Jeremy Corbyn had capitulated, that the Labour Party was now officially going to back the position of a second referendum. But, of course, overnight, the speculation became, well, what would the question be? And this morning, with Nick Ferrari on LBC, Keir Starmer explained what he thought that choice should be.
The choice should be between a credible leave option and remain.
Oh, dear.
And we expressly agreed yesterday that if the Prime Minister's deal gets through, that deal should be subject to the lock, if you like, of a public vote. Obviously, precise wording will be a matter for Parliament, further discussion, but that's the basic option.
And what would you campaign for?
I would campaign for remain.
Oh, there's a shock. There's a real shock. So, basically, what we're being told by Keir Starmer, Sir Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, is there should be a second referendum between Mrs May's deal, that's really what he's saying, and remain. And Emily Thornberry, on Twitter, has made it very, very clear that she thinks that it is between Mrs May's deal and remain. I mean, I'm asking myself why remain should even be on the ballot paper, given that we voted on this and it was decided and we moved on through a general election and 500 MPs voting for Article 50. But even if there was a second referendum, Mrs May's deal, well, that's not Brexit, that's Brexit in name only. It makes me very, very angry. Here was Jeremy Corbyn's response to Theresa May earlier on today.
Labour accepts the result of the referendum,
Really?
but we believe...
What a joke.
But, Mr. Speaker, we believe in getting the terms of our exit right. That's why we believe in our alternative plan. The Prime Minister's botched deal provides no certainty or guarantees for the future and was comprehensively rejected by this House. We cannot risk our country's industry and people's livelihoods. And so, if it somehow does pass in some form at a later stage, we believe there must be a confirmatory public vote to see if people feel that's what they voted for. A no-deal outcome would be disastrous.
So no deal is not what anybody in Parliament seems to want, even though a growing number in the country want. And I think with what Keir Starmer said, with Emily Thornberry saying whatever deal she gets through versus remain, with what Corbyn said, folks, we're clear. Labour are proposing a second referendum, and they're proposing Mrs May's deal, whether it goes through or not, frankly, against remain. I'm asking you, should remain even be on the ballot paper? And my answer is no. We voted on this already. But there's an even deeper question here. If there was a second referendum and it was remain against her deal, I've got to tell you, and I mean this, I would not vote. I would not campaign. I'd go fishing for a month. Because it wouldn't even give us the option of genuinely leaving the European Union. I don't think Labour understand just how much damage their proposal is doing. Firstly, to the democratic process, and secondly, to their own chances, albeit they've become slimmer in the last few weeks, of winning the next election. So let me ask you, should remain be on the ballot paper, and we'll move on from there. And if you think, yep, because 16.1 million people voted for it, well then call me. Try and persuade me. It won't be easy, but have a go. And by the way, don't be scared, because the whole point of this programme, the whole point of LBC, is to have proper debate. So if you think remain should be an option, and Farage, you've got this wrong, call 0345 6060 973. Or if, like me, you think it's got no right to even be on the ballot paper, text to 84850. And you agree with me that any second referendum that did not include a no-deal, clean Brexit would be an outrage? Please tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And, of course, Facebookers, you can comment there too. I am going to go straight to Catherine, who's calling from Ealing. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Well, I
I agree with you. There shouldn't be a second referendum. I agree with you totally. But if there is one, I don't actually fear it, because I agree with Diane Abbott. I think that Leave will still win. And so what I would propose is have the same questions as before, Leave or Remain. But under the Leave, if you vote Leave, you then have a subsection. Do you want to leave no deal Brexit, or do you want to leave with Mrs May's Brexit? And so you still have you don't split the vote by having three options. You still have two clear options.
I think in democratic terms, Catherine, that would be a lot more acceptable than the kind of three-card trick that was proposed by, I think Justine Greening was the first person to put this idea forward. I would agree with that. But isn't it very complicated to give people a two-part referendum? I mean, shouldn't a referendum be a simple binary choice?
Well, the thing is, we've already had that one. And so, I mean, I agree. I don't think there should be a second referendum. There's been a referendum. They should deliver it. I agree on that. But they're trying to have a second referendum because they think they're going to win. But I don't think they will win. I think if they had a second referendum... But, Nigel, you do worry me when you say you're going to go fishing, because people have to vote. Because that's how Remain will win.
Catherine, let me repeat what I just said. If it's Mrs May's deal against Remain, and that's it, I won't be voting. Because it doesn't offer me Brexit. It doesn't offer me... Because Mrs May's deal means we can be stuck inside the customs union in perpetuity. That is not what I've campaigned for. It's not what I voted for. It would be unacceptable at every level. And Catherine, can I throw the ball back to you? Why should Remain even be on the ballot paper?
Well, I totally agree with you, but Remain will be on there because that's what people want.
Who?
The people who are trying to frustrate Brexit at every turn.
So the MPs want Remain to be on the ballot paper, but do the people want it to be on the ballot paper?
Well, I think the people have already voted. They voted Brexit. And they'll vote Brexit.
So let me repeat my question, Catherine. Why should Remain be on the blooming ballot paper?
Well, if you and I had the choice, it wouldn't be.
Right,
but
let's make sure we prevail then. It's an outrageous idea. However, if we do get a second referendum, and if there was a choice of how we leave, and one of them was a clear leave, as opposed to the worst deal in history, Mrs May's withdrawal agreement, that would be a lot better, I agree with you, than what is being proposed by, at the moment, Jeremy Corbyn, Emily Thornberry and Keir Starmer. Thank you. Michael is a first-time caller from Whitechapel. Good evening, Michael.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
Oh, well, I'm pretty blooming angry, Michael, really, but there we are.
Your conversation's rather good as it happens.
No, I mean, Michael, I'm furious. I'm furious.
I've always liked you, but you're just in the wrong party, I'm afraid, but I've always liked you.
Oh, what party should I be in, then?
Where he was before.
Well, what, UKIP or the Conservatives? I was in both.
Conservatives.
So come on, Michael, let's get to the point. Should Remain even be on the ballot paper?
No, because it was refused from the word go. It was a move. I mean, I actually voted to Remain at the last second.
Yep.
But I've changed my mind now, and I want to just one out. And out means out. It shouldn't even be anywhere near the paper.
No, it shouldn't. So why are the Labour Party suggesting that it should be?
Because he's weak-kneed.
What, Corbyn?
Yes.
Well, I guess he's been rather bullied into this by his parliamentary party.
Exactly. I mean, Theresa's only problem is she should have gone into Brussels with Maggie's handbag, and she'd have got things done.
Well, I agree.
Too sweet.
I agree. Michael, if there was a second referendum, which I'm opposed to, the previous caller, Catherine, was opposed to, you're opposed to, but if there was a second referendum, I guess there is one question that might be a fair question. Mrs May's deal versus no deal.
I can't stand fishing, but I'll join you.
All right. OK, thank you, Michael. Your message is coming in. Nigel, I'm a bit confused. How can having another referendum without having the option... How can we have it without the options to leave? David, you're absolutely right. You know, I mean, and that's why I just could not engage in a referendum that was Mrs May's deal against Remain. What would be the point? The decision has already been taken. The country voted leave. Any referendum should be between May's deal or no deal. No ifs, no buts. Tony from Church Langley, I agree with you. But why go through the agony? Why go through the uncertainty of yet another referendum we've voted already? Paul in Braintree says, I am very angry with both parties' actions over the past few days. When will they just accept the result and not try to change it to suit their own agenda? Well, Paul, I have to tell you, Paul, if you're very angry now, I think you're going to get quite a lot angrier over the course of the next month. Because, Paul, everybody, what's going to happen in the next month is the Brexit vote is going to be betrayed. I predict that pretty confidently. Should Remain be on the ballot paper for a second referendum? Stephen is calling from Hatton Garden. Good evening.
Hi there, good evening. I'm happy. I don't think we need another referendum because the country's spoken.
Okay.
But if we do have another referendum, I think Remain should be on the ballot. And I agree with Diane Abbott, like a previous caller. 52% of the country will vote to Remain and 73% will vote to leave.
I'm not sure about your arithmetic, Stephen, but I do understand what you're saying. I mean, I'm actually in no doubt that if there was a second referendum, the Leave majority would be even bigger. I mean, I genuinely believe that. I genuinely believe that. And I think we see it here on LBC. A lot of people ringing up saying, look, I was Remain, but we've got to respect democracy. But, Stephen, why should we go through this whole agony again?
100%. I agree with you totally. The country's spoken. It's enough. Otherwise, every time we have a general election, if they're not happy with the result, let's have another election.
Exactly. Why not reverse it? Or why not, Stephen? Why not abolish democracy and put the European Commission in charge of everything, which, of course, is why we voted leave in the first place. Stephen, thank you. Thank you, everybody. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 6:15 and time for the news headlines with Philip Chryssikos. It's 24 hours since we learned that the Labour Party is going to back a second referendum. The overnight question is, what would it be actually about? We're learning very clearly that Labour thinks it should be Mrs May's deal against Remain. My view is Remain shouldn't even be on the ballot paper. Mrs May's deal isn't actually leave. It's Brexit in name only. I've made my position clear. If that was the question, firstly, I believe there would have to be an amendment passed to make sure that a certain percentage of the population voted to make it a valid referendum. We did this with the Scottish referendum back in 1979, and I say that because I wouldn't vote in that referendum. I'd stay at home. I'm not encouraging you not to participate, not to vote. I would not engage in it because I would not have a proper Brexit choice. This needs to be crushed very early on. But before we get to that stage, we have got an extraordinary week in British politics coming up in March. Let's listen to what Mrs May, our Prime Minister, said today in the House of Commons about a potential extension of Article 50.
If the House, having rejected leaving with the deal negotiated with the EU, then rejects leaving on the 29th of March without a withdrawal agreement and future framework, the Government will, on the 14th of March, bring forward a motion on whether Parliament wants to seek a short, limited extension to Article 50. And if the House votes for an extension, seek to agree that extension approved by the House with the EU and bring forward the necessary legislation to change the exit date commensurate with that extension.
This, by the way, folks, is the Prime Minister who's told us again and again and again we will be leaving on March the 29th. Now she's talking about extension. Let's go through the timetabling of this, the whats and whens, with LBC's political editor, Theo Usherwood. Theo, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
Please tell us what is going to happen in that second week of March.
OK, March the 12th, that is going to be a second meaningful vote on whatever the Prime Minister has negotiated with the European Union, whatever improvements she's managed to get. Now, she was fairly open in the House of Commons this afternoon before she came onto the timetabling issue that she was only talking about changing the political declaration. That's the non-legally binding document on what happens next. It's not the withdrawal agreement.
Yeah.
So then we have, March 12th we have the meaningful vote.
Yep.
March the 13th, we then have a vote on whether the UK leaves the European Union without a deal. We know from the arithmetic in the House of Commons that there simply isn't a majority for a no-deal Brexit in the House of Commons, and so it's very unlikely that that motion would pass. And if it was to pass, and the Parliament was to say that it's not prepared to allow the UK to leave without a deal, we then come on to March the 14th, the third vote, and that is on extending Article 50 for a short, limited period of time, as the Prime Minister put it to MPs in the House of Commons today. But, and there is a but to this, she refused to say, and she was asked repeatedly, which way she would whip her MPs. Would she demand that Conservative MPs go through the voting lobbies to extend Article 50? And that's important because she's still trying to hold out with members of her party who are Eurosceptic, members of the ERG who are meeting right now, that she is prepared for Britain to leave the European Union without a deal. And of course that is the status quo, and it would mean not extending Article 50. The other thing to mention, and this is something I know you're well aware of, Nigel, is that on April the 18th, the European Parliament breaks so that MEPs can start campaigning
and basically
in what are going to be the most fiercely fought European elections
Brussels closes down, doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely. But Theo, I'm just thinking through this. I mean, these 3 days of purgatory that the Prime Minister has got lined up for the country. I mean, logic would say that if her vote fails, and if Parliament refuses to accept a no-deal exit, that there would be a majority for a time-limited extension. But what would happen, I'm speculating here, if logic didn't follow through, and in the end there was a majority for nothing?
So then Theresa May has three options. She can go round again with a third meaningful vote. and you laugh, but there is scope for that because, of course, you've got the European Council Summit on the 21st of March, and she could go back to that meeting and say, now, listen, come on, I need something now. And, of course, they could, there is within the fact that there is a European Council summit, the possibility of reopening the withdrawal agreement and getting that signed off by the European Council. However unlikely, they say that is Brussels, of that actually happening. Then she could call a general election. Of course, she has said she won't lead the Conservative Party into a general election in 2022. She's
good at breaking promises, though, isn't she?
Yes, and then of course the third option is to hold a people's vote. And of course, Labour came out yesterday and said there should be a people's vote, and it should be on the choice should be between remaining in the European Union and the deal that the Prime Minister gets through Parliament. But, and this is in reflection of Jeremy Corbyn's well-known Eurosceptic views. 2 points I would make to this as to whether that is a real promise from Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour leadership, is that Labour isn't supporting the Prime Minister's deal, and of course so many Tory MPs aren't supporting the Prime Minister's deal, and so in all likelihood Jeremy Corbyn can make that kind of promise in the full knowledge that he would never be made to keep it, because the Prime Minister's deal is not going to get through in the calculation that he and his aides have made, and so there would never be a choice between the Prime Minister's deal and leaving and remaining in the European Union. The second point I would make is that in the House of Commons today, Jeremy Corbyn said he would support two amendments. First is the Labour amendment, which is closer alignment to the single market and, of course, a permanent customs union. The second amendment he said he would mention was support, or Labour would support, as an amendment tabled by Alberta Costas, to a Labour MP, to safeguard the rights of EU citizens in the event of a no-deal Brexit. But what he didn't say that Labour would support, and this is the obvious one for anybody who wants to support a second referendum, is an amendment tabled by the Labour MP Peter Kyle, which says that the Prime Minister, to get a deal through the House of Commons, is perfectly possible, but she has to put that deal back before the country. And for somebody who's come out and said yesterday that he would support a people's vote, that would be the obvious one to go for.
But he's a bit half-hearted. Theo, thank you. And Theo Ashwood laying out there 3 days of purgatory in March. At the end of it all, logic says Parliament will vote to extend Article 50. That is what I think, folks, they will do, although it's possible we'll finish up with nothing being agreed, with no parliamentary majority for anything. That is possible. Unlikely, but possible. And in that case, and this is worth remembering, because it's getting forgotten in this Brexit debate, there is a piece of legislation in place. It is the EU Withdrawal Act. And unless the government puts forward plans to change that legislation, we would leave on March the 29th with no deal. I'm saying that to cheer up Brexiteers. I don't for a moment think it will happen. But if we do move on from that to a second referendum, what should the question be? Should Remain even be on the paper? Ashley on Facebook says a second referendum must be on the form of Brexit, not Remain. We've already had that vote. It must be respected. Tina says, if Remain's on the ballot paper and they win, I want the best of three. Well, Tina, of course, that's right. And why not rerun the general election every Thursday, or the Scottish referendum, or whatever it may be? John is a first-time caller from Wantage in Oxfordshire. Good evening.
Good evening to you, sir.
So, should Remain be on the ballot paper, John?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm fed up with this circus. We're going round and round and
we
round.
all are.
So there is only one way. This is about our future relationship with Europe. There is uncertainty with us so-called crashing out. I think it's independence, but people are keen on calling it crashing out. I think we take our chances and do that. And I think the only way we can do that is have an in-out referendum. However, if we decide to remain in, we're also agreeing to take the euro. We're also agreeing to move our arms forces over to Europe, and we just basically, every bit of sovereignty gets handed over, and we accept that we are part of a European master race. And that's the end of it.
What
so
about the master race bit? I mean, the master race...
If you want to take your chances, vote out.
John, the master race comment, I disagree with. The rest of it I would agree with. And yet, you know what will happen in that referendum if it comes? They'll lie about it. Just as Nick Clegg told me a European army was a dangerous fantasy. I do understand, John, United States of Europe versus independence. I do understand that. But John, why should Remain even be on the ballot paper?
About our children and our children's future. So... there's only one direction it's going to be, and it's going to be the countries that remain in Europe propping up the rest of it under a currency that's just not working, under a European direction that is self-serving and serving the masters, and it'll be supported by an army. So if that's what we want to be part of, let's vote in. Yeah. That's what you want, and I don't believe they'll get much take-up for that vote. I think we'll take our chances.
And, John, run by Mr Juncker, which before lunch is worrying and after lunch is terrifying. Thank you. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It is now 6:30 and time for the news with Philip Chryssikos. Labour want a second referendum and they appear to want it to be Mrs May's deal versus Remain. Should Remain even be on the ballot paper? I think no. And if it was that choice, I just don't think I could even personally be bothered to vote. What would be the point? And what does all this mean? I was saying last night that I felt this would be a catastrophe for the Labour Party in terms of the next general election. If the Tory party managed to hold together, which is by no means certain, but if they do, I think Labour have just lost the next general election. Let me elaborate. 61% of the seats that Labour hold in the House of Commons right now voted Leave. But that's really pretty irrelevant compared with this next figure. 78% of Labour's target seats in England and Wales voted Leave, and some of them very heavily. And perhaps even more thoughtful point for the Labour Party. Of the seats they hold, with majorities of less than 2,000, 72% voted Leave. Far from this policy winning the Labour Party the next general election, looking at those numbers and knowing, as I do, a lot of Labour Leave voters who just don't want us to be separate from the European Union. They want border controls, drastic reductions in immigration into this country. I think this policy, they might, in North London, of course, they might increase their 18,000 majority to 21,000, but that doesn't actually make any difference under our system. I think with this policy, the number of Labour seats will actually go down at the next election. This is electoral disaster for the Labour Party if, as I say, the Tories hold together. Back to our question. Thousands of comments coming in for you. Gillian in Darlington says, I'd like a general election. Parties' positions on Brexit are very clear. Well, Gillian, you're right, because the SNP favour Remain and a second referendum. Plaid, favour Remain and a second referendum. The Greens, favour Remain and a second referendum. The Liberal Democrats, favour Remain and a second referendum. The Labour Party, favour Remain and a second referendum. Sinn Féin, favour Remain and a second referendum. Oh, and Chucker and his chums, not that they're a party, favour Remain and a second referendum, and they'll find out very quickly that their highly principled stance leaves them in a very crowded field. And, Gillian, Mrs May's Tory party support Leave. The trouble is, they don't really support Leave. They support Mrs May's deal, which is Brexit in name only. I ask all of you to guess where the real space in British politics is. Is it in the centre? Is it in the second referendum ground, or is it in the clear Brexit ground? That's a debate I've no doubt we're going to come back to as the next few weeks unfold. Neil in Leigh-on-Sea, where I was yesterday morning, a lovely part of the world, says, if the options are Remain or May's deal, I fear Remain would win convincingly because May's deal is so bad. Perhaps that's her master plan. You cynic, Neil. Well, Remain may well win, but I think if that question was asked, it is vital that the Commons passes an amendment to say that there must be at least a turnout of 50% of the electorate for it to be a valid result. Because I'm not urging you, but I will not be voting in that referendum. Let me make it clear. Jason in Basingstoke is a perpetual optimist. He says, I believe Article 50 should be extended by 3 months, then call a general election where all candidates must stipulate Leave or Remain. Yes, Jason. And then turn turtle on us. Like Heidi Allen. Heidi Allen from South Cambridgeshire, Conservative MP, who said after the referendum we must respect the result, has now left the Conservatives, joined Chucker and his chums, and now wants a second referendum. Why would any of us actually trust them? How about the referendum, says Sharon in Stourbridge. May's deal or no deal? I think the politicians would be surprised how many want to leave with no deal. Well, they would, Sharon, you're right. Let's go down to Woking and speak to Darren. Good evening.
Evening, Nigel. How are you? Angry? Frustrated?
I say angry, but I just... The trouble is, Darren, I said last August that I thought that extension of Article 50 was the most likely outcome, and lots of my friends who'd been on the Leave side from lots of different parties said, please, come on, don't be ridiculous, it's all going to be okay. And I just, Darren, have this sense it's not all going to be okay.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one of the most... we'll come to the question in a second if we can. But,
sure.
I'm an average Leaver. I used to be very pro-EU. We spoke before. My frustration is when I speak to anyone who would be classed as a hardline Leaver, any talk of trying to deal with the upcoming pending second referendum that I've been going on about for 6-12 months, you get shut down and told not to talk about it because you're encouraging it. And the point is no, we need to prepare for it. We won the battle in 2016, and we're very, very close to losing the war. And for that
well,
reason...
actually, Darren, we won the war, we're losing the peace, I think is the right way to put it.
Fair enough. Where the conclusion I'm coming to is if the second referendum is forced, Remain has to become an option. And it pains me to say
Why?
that, Nigel, but because we have to win this once and for all. We have to close down what will be a never-ending narrative that we were lied to, misled, all of the things that they've used. It will go on forever. We have to shut it down. And I actually proposed a long time ago exactly what Catherine said, your first caller.
Yep.
I believe it should be, do you wish to leave the European Union, yes or no? And then under no, under yes if you want to leave, or however it's worded, then do you support the Withdrawal Act under Theresa May's deal, or is it a managed no deal scenario?
Okay, well, Darren, I'm quite tempted. I mean, there's a little bit of me here that is quite tempted by that. There's a little bit of me here that is quite tempted by that, because at least the genuine Leave's on the ballot paper. What galls me, Darren, what really galls me is we've had this vote about Remain. We backed it up in a general election. 498 MPs voted for Article 50. Why on earth should we vote on it again? But you feel this will be the once-in-a-lifetime knockout blow, do you?
It has. No, I'm completely with you. To me, this undermines democracy. I said a year ago, how am I going to bring up my two young children to believe in the political system and our democratic system? How am I going to raise them to believe that their voice can be heard, that they can make a difference, that they can change and shape our country? It is a farce, but it is the last knockout blow. And I have to say also, if I'm forced to choose between Remain and Theresa May's deal, I will have no choice. I will not go fishing for a month. I think you're wrong to say that. I understand why you're saying it. I will have no choice but to back remaining in the EU, because this is not an ideology to me that is about we must get out at all costs. I bought in to the beliefs that we can take a different path, a different direction, forge a new future and create new opportunity. The Withdrawal Act as it stands will stifle those opportunities. Even if the backstop is resolved, that is a misnomer. There's so much wrong with it where we'll become a vassal state. It's everything that we are against. It will ruin our country. I would almost beg you to vote Remain in that
Darren, do you know what?
I can't believe I'm saying it.
You make your point so well, you ought to be in politics. You really ought to. Great call. It's the second time you've called me. Call me again. I, of course, can't endorse voting Remain or even Remain being on the ballot paper. But it's difficult in some ways. In some ways, difficult to see... not to see some logic in what Darren says, because we're leaving a rotten treaty organisation for an even worse treaty organisation. You could even make the argument, of course, that at least with the EU, with the Lisbon Treaty, Article 50 existed. With what Mrs May wants us to sign up to, there is absolutely no way out of the backstop once it's triggered, and we could be stuck in the customs union, in EU rules, pretty much in perpetuity. I get on Twitter, Remain being on a ballot paper for a second referendum would be undemocratic. A three-way choice of Remain, deal or no deal would split the Leave vote, would equal unfair and advantage to Remain. I don't believe that the Electoral Commission, I mean, not that I'm great mates with them, you understand, but I don't believe the Electoral Commission would allow a multiple choice three-way referendum. Would they allow a Leave or Remain and then a choice on how we leave? Well, that's okay, but we also would have to ask, what kind of Remain would we want? Do we want to be European Army, United States of Europe? Do we want to be... should Mr Juncker perhaps replace the Queen? I don't know. This is all food for thought. You're listening to The Nigel Farrow Show. I am teasing you a bit. It's 6:45 and time for the news headlines with Philip Chrysikos. John in Ashford sends me a text and says, your callers make more sense than the politicians do, and they tell us that we didn't know what we were voting for. John, I agree with you. And John in Leicester says to me, Nigel, still no discussion about Article 24. Well, John, I was on Sky News this morning, 9 o'clock, sharp, fast out of the blocks with Adam Bolton, and when he talked about the crashing out disaster that no deal represented, I said, well, Article 24 of the GATT Treaty, it makes it clear we've got 2 years in which a negotiation can take place with no tariff, no quota. And he kind of looked shocked at this because nobody else that goes on the programme even talks about it. John, I'm doing my best to talk about it. The trouble is, Parliament, and I suspect Mrs May, do not want us to leave with a clean Brexit. And the reason she will put this to the House of Commons on the 13th of March is so that when it's voted down, she can say, not my fault, Gov. I did my absolute best. It's Parliament that took it from me. And of course, Article 24 would be negotiated by the WTO, who are based in Geneva, which takes me straight to Geneva because Stuart is a first-time caller from that city. Good evening, Stuart.
Good evening, Nigel. Finally, nice to hear from you. I've been a fan for many years, and really happy.
Well, welcome,
to be on the show.
Welcome to LBC. So, Stuart, the Labour Party, well, everybody really, apart from the Tories, at the moment, pushing for a second referendum, and I just don't think Remain should be on the ballot paper.
Well, I think your previous guest made a great point as to why, if it were to be on the ballot, we should definitely vote again in order to leave. That's for sure. But why should it be in the first place on the ballot? That is absolutely beyond me, Nigel. I voted to leave.
Yep.
I voted to leave. And that's it. I don't know, people have... I always carry my opinions I'm pretty vocal with my opinions, and I've been accused of always being a racist or things like that. But I am not. I have an economics background. I work in business, and I have been backing leaving the European Union before Cameron even started thinking about it.
But Stuart,
and
what the other side, Stuart, Stuart, what the other side would say to you is that you didn't vote for a no-deal Brexit. That's what they'd say.
Yeah, but to me, that goes beyond understanding what it's people that don't understand what the European Union is. That say such a thing.
What did you, Stuart? It's a
political union.
Why did you vote to leave?
It's not an economic. Well, I voted to leave because I'm lucky enough to be half French and half British. So I saw what they did with all the treaties in France. We voted in France. We voted no many times, and in the end, it was yes for Lisbon, through Lisbon. Sorry, and. The democracy itself is ruined through this whole institution, and economically, being part of a club that has one currency governing multiple economies with multiple taxation issues, differences, etc., just doesn't make sense. And in the end, every nation should just rule themselves, be happy neighbours, etc.
Is it possible, Stuart?
Just not be part.
Stuart, is it possible that the denial of democracy to the French, when they voted against the European Constitution, when they were forced into the euro without a referendum and find themselves unable to decide many of their economic affairs, is it possible that that total loss of democratic control and trust in the system has led towards 14 Saturdays in a row of yellow vest demonstrations in Paris?
I think it's spot on what you just said.
Well, I was asking a question. I wasn't advocating it, but no, Stuart, I think it is very possible. I think it is. I think if you take away the value of democracy, people use other means. Stuart, I love your passion. Thank you. Now, Dan on Twitter says the referendum question should be no deal or no Brexit. Well, I tell you what, Dan, you've put it very simply and very well. But no Brexit means remain, and therefore I reject what you have to say. Bill from Southend takes the view. I think if there has to be a second referendum, the choice is got to be binary. Well, I think ultimately, the Electoral Commission bill would probably agree with that. So WTO or May's deal. Well, Bill, and then he goes on to say, the trouble is MPs won't allow it and it'll become WTO or Remain. Why should Remain be on the ballot paper? Why should it be? I object to it. Kyle, why should Remain be on the ballot paper?
Because, I mean, I hear leavers here who are running scared that they're going to lose what they voted for. And lose.
I'm not scared. No, not at all, Carl.
Well, I have not heard any other reason why it shouldn't be on the paper.
Because we've done it. It's over. It's finished, Kyle. It's done. It's put to bed. We voted for it. We confirmed it in the general election.
Let me finish my point, because I also hear Remainers who are kind of clutching at straw, thinking that this is going to be their way to get what they want, right? But the real thing is here, take away whether you think the UK should be in the European Union or not. Take away whether you even think we should have a second referendum or not. Mm-hmm. If one goes ahead, is it not the democratically safest thing to do to make sure that the people that are voting in this election in this referendum actually want to go ahead and for us to leave the EU? We know that the population has changed in the 3 years since the last vote, and certainly...
No, we don't.
We do. We know that. We do. There are, we know that there are people who will have voted in that who are no longer with us, and that there are people who are now eligible to vote.
Carl, there is no... Sir John Curtis, who is the doyen says there has been no appreciable change in the public vote on this. Carl,
I'm not talking about whether people's views have changed, whether the population who are going to, whether it will be that the public are now more in favour of Remain than they were 3 years ago. But what I'm saying is, we should be making sure that the people who are going to vote in this referendum actually want to leave the EU.
So should no deal, Carl? Carl, should no deal be on the paper?
Without giving them the full set of options.
So are you suggest, Carl, because time is running out, I'm very going to press you very quickly. Mm-hmm. If we do have a second referendum, I object to it. If we do, should no deal be on the ballot paper?
Yes, absolutely.
OK, Carl, I'm going to love you and leave you. I'm heading down to the New Forest to speak to Matthew, who's 16 years old. Welcome, Matthew, to LBC.
Hello, Nigel.
So, if we have this referendum...
ballot paper.
You do? Yeah. Why?
Well, you say the public opinion hasn't changed. I was reading a headline by LBC last month talking about crossover day, where it estimates that now enough Leave voters have died and enough people are now of voting age that we're actually a majority Remain country. And if you do what was allowed in the Scottish independence referendum and allow 16-year-olds to vote, I reckon we'd be a Remain country.
Why is it, Matthew, Matthew, why is that? We've got 15 seconds left. Why is it age 16 you think our country should be governed by unelected people like Juncker and Tusk? Do tell me.
Well, they're appointed by an elected government, aren't they, Nigel?
But you can't vote for them, Matthew.
Seeing as we still have things like the House of Lords, I mean, wouldn't it be better to stay in the EU, reform it, and appoint these
Well, I tell you what, Matthew,
to the Commission who would...
You must call back again, but the House of Lords do not have the right to propose primary legislation. In Europe, only the Commission can do so. Matthew, come back. Let's debate this another time. I'll be back tomorrow evening at 6, at 10 tonight. It's Tom Swarbrick, but up next, it's Ian Dale.
Nigel, thank you very much. Well, at 8, we're